Welcome to Fragile Synchronicities, Families, Mobility, Work Scheduling, and Precarious Employment Organization. We're glad you're all joining us today. My name is Yusra Benjeloun, Administrative Coordinator and Project Manager with the Work Wellness and Disability Prevention Institute, and I'll be co-moderating the webinar today. This webinar is made possible through the support of the Community Gaming Grant Program through the BC government, as well as donations and memberships to WWDPI. We thank our program partners, Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, Education Advisory Committee, and speakers who contribute to this webinar series. While we're waiting for others to join us, I'll go over a few technical points for the webinar. You should be able to hear the presentation through your computer, speakers, or through the conference call line if you dialed in. Please use the question box to submit any issues you may be experiencing and to ask any questions you have related to the presentation. We will collect questions submitted throughout the presentation and follow the presentation with a Q&A based on the questions submitted. Any questions not answered in the allotted time will be answered and distributed after the event. The presentation will be recorded and posted for free on our website within a week, along with the slides. You will be emailed with the direct links for all of these items when they're available. Our co-moderator, Nora Spinks, will be introducing our presenters shortly and will also be running our Q&A session. Nora Spinks is the CEO of Vanier Institute of the Family. The Vanier Institute of the Family is a national, independent, charitable organization dedicated to understanding the diversity and complexity of families and the reality of family life in Canada. And now, I will hand it over to you, Nora, for introducing Dr. Barb Neese and Elise Thorburn.
Thank you so much, Yusra. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this afternoon. It is indeed my pleasure to introduce Dr. Barb Neese from the Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador and Dr. Elise Thorburn, who will be sharing with us some of their most recent findings from a very interesting study on exploring work-related mobility in Canada. So Barb, I'd like to start with you. Can you just tell us why it's important for us as Canadians, as employers, as unions, as policymakers to understand work-related mobility in Canada?
Well, work-related mobility is increasing. The proportion of people working at home is declining. It's also, work-related mobility is becoming longer and more complex. The average commute based on the census from 2016 is about an hour a day now, and that's up from the previous census. And 9.4% of people in the census commuted up to 2 hours a day or more. But that's only a proportion of the people in Canada who engage in long and extended mobility for work. It underestimates the number of people involved in interprovincial mobility, so your long-distance labor commuters really are not well picked up in the census. It doesn't include really attention to the mobility that's a huge part of some sectors like the transportation sector, for example. And it doesn't include temporary foreign workers. We now have, particularly when you include international students who are in the Canadian labor market, we're looking at another 500,000 people who are working in Canada who are a long way from home, who are engaged in a form of work-related mobility. So it's a huge, complex issue, and at the same time as it's becoming more common and more complicated, families are changing in Canada. They're getting smaller. They're often living further away from the type of support that they might have had in the past, and workplaces are changing as well. And one of the big changes in work is the increase in precarious employment. And all of that has implications for how do we put together complicated, prolonged commuting with a different world of work and a different world for families.
So these commutes are more common in cities, and even though there are a higher proportion of rural workers engaged in interprovincial employment, most of them are connected to a family in some way, shape, or form. Dr. Thorburn, can we just move to you for a second, and can you describe fragile synchronicities? What does that mean for you? What does your research show?
Well, we were talking about fragile synchronicities to sort of highlight the ways in which there are rhythms to daily life. There's sort of the family life has its own particular rhythm. Your mobility has its own particular rhythm. Your work has its own particular rhythm. And sometimes those rhythms can be controlled by you, and you can make them synchronous. And sometimes they can be quite asynchronous. You know, the rhythm of your family might not synchronize very well with the rhythms of your workplace or the rhythms of your mobility. And so we're trying to kind of understand the way you can build these synchronicities or not based on things like scheduling and your commute times and when and where your children have to be, for example, dropped off at daycare or picked up from school. And so we're trying to understand how mobile workers in particular can start to or can or cannot synchronize these rhythms. And the fragile synchronicities comes in when we start to understand the ways in which people's work is in many cases very precarious, especially amongst lower income workers. Work can be precarious. You can have no control over your scheduling. One of the things I looked at was the ways in which some people's work schedules can be set up by algorithms that pay more attention to or are more concerned with the rhythms of capital flows than the rhythms of workers' lives. So how one can build a bit of synchronicity into your life, and that can very easily be thrown off, and it can be very fragile depending on the precarity of your work, the income you're earning, the amount of control you have over your schedule, and the supports you have for family life and family care, for example. So kind of trying to understand that in some ways synchronicities can be built in depending on your workplace and your profession, and in some cases those synchronicities can be very fragile.
So it sounds to me like this is of importance to people who study work and work-related stress and work and family, also to employers and HR professionals, unions, and policymakers as well. So just before we get into learning more about this, we just want to get a sense of who you are attending this seminar. So if we could just ask the first poll question, do you commute to work? Yes or no? If you could just answer the question, if you commute to work. And what's important to understand about commute is that many times people will have their own frame of reference when learning about different ways of working. And so we want to get a sense of who you are and just pause for a minute to think about how you commute and how many different ways that you commute.
So for the results of the poll, we have so far 40% yeses and 60% nos.
60% no's. That's interesting.
You're not a representative.
Not a representative
population.
Which is very interesting. Can we move to the second question, please, Yusra? Second question is, how long is your average commute? What your average commute is. Is it less than 1 hour, 1 to 2 hours, or more than 2 hours? And we'll see if you're a little bit more representative for those of you who do commute to work. So the responses are coming in.
Mm-hmm. So far we've collected 89% of less than an hour, 11% 1 hour to 2 hours, and 0% more than 2 hours.
Great, thank you. So we can close the poll, and Barb, I'd like to ask you a little bit about your research. So tell us a little bit about the On the Move Partnership. This is a unique opportunity for us to dig deep on a particular topic. Can you tell us about who's involved and how it all came about?
Yeah, so we got interested in these issues and questions around mobility for work about 8 or 9 years ago, partly because we were working in Newfoundland and Labrador, and there were so many people working in other provinces, and we had absolutely no information about them. We didn't know how many there were, we didn't know what they were earning, we didn't know where they were. So that was where it started, but then it grew into a national study. We got funding for that study, and we put together a largely Canadian team of researchers, but also some international researchers, many of who were interested in work or had worked on families, but really, and some of them had worked on mobility, but they hadn't looked at the three things together. Lots of different disciplines involved, different universities and partner organizations, including the Vanier Institute for the Family. And we had, basically, we've done research that's used 4 different methods. We've done policy research, statistical research, although the statistical resources have been pretty lean, and that was one of the reasons why we started this study. We've done a lot of field research and also some online surveys. And essentially, the main concept here is employment-related geographical mobility. So we're looking at mobility to and within work. Particularly extended or complex mobility. And we're looking at the spectrum from daily commutes right through to prolonged absences for work, as in long-distance labor commuting, in mining or in construction. And we're also including temporary foreign workers in the study.
So just before we get into the details of the study, can you tell us a little bit about the CBC partnership and the work that you've been doing to get this message out to people across the country?
Sure. So when we got the funding, we organized a partnership with CBC Ideas. So Paul Kennedy has worked with us over the last 8 years, and he's produced 4 different radio documentaries for Ideas based on the field, largely the field research that's been done by On the Move researchers in Montreal, in Newfoundland, in Toronto, in Fort McMurray, and so on.
Great. So can you tell us a little bit more about the study? You talked about extended daily commutes. Can you just give us a little bit more detail about what that means and what that looks like?
Okay, so in terms of extended daily commutes, for example, we've looked at construction workers in Newfoundland and Labrador who were living, a lot of them, in the St. John's area, and during the construction of offshore oil and gas for Hebron, they were building a big platform. They were commuting from St. John's for an hour to an hour and a half each way out to the Bull Arm construction site and out to build the Long Harbour mineral processing plant as well. So we looked at them, but we also looked at precariously employed immigrant workers in Toronto who were commuting on public transit. Again, as I've said, we've looked at Canadian. There's quite a lot of work happened through On the Move on temporary foreign workers as well. We've done field research in 7 provinces, including British Columbia, Nova Scotia, and again, rural and urban. And this is really unusual. When we started this project, basically we had research on one type of mobility in one sector and so on, and we wanted to bring all that together and to look at all the different types of sectors and types of work that were out there.
So most of the time people think about gas and oil, but you also included professionals and you included people like me who spend a lot of time in airports, and my commute for years was 2 hours, but it was by plane. And so if I walk for 2 hours or I take a plane for 2 hours, there's a different number of kilometers between home and work. And so you needed to focus on certain industries and sectors. So can you tell us a little bit about the sectors that you began to examine in a little bit more detail?
Sure. So in terms of oil and gas extraction, the main focus there was in the Fort McMurray region, where we had a lot of the people from Newfoundland and Labrador. That's where it turned out that's where they were going, and from other parts of Atlantic Canada. So that was one of the areas. In northern British Columbia, we looked at mining as well, and now they're looking at the Site C mine hydro development. A lot of work on construction. A lot of the resource development work that's happening is construction related. Construction work is huge in the Canadian economy. It's gotten much bigger, and it's largely mobile work. Even in the residential sector, you may not be commuting long distances, but you're working in transient workplaces. So your commute from home to work could be changing on a regular basis. We looked at healthcare. So we have a whole section on healthcare workers in Nova Scotia, including home care. So particularly people who are involved in the community care sector and in the home care sector often engage in a high level of mobility, but we also have, again, temporary foreign workers who are coming in often as students in the healthcare sector and then moving into employment in the home care sector and other parts of that sector in Nova Scotia. And in the service sector as well. Service sector workers, you don't get the same kind of often high level distance commuting, but you in the camps in Fort McMurray, you have people who are essentially in the service sector. They're feeding all of those mobile workers. A lot of them tend to be temporary foreign workers, and in the hospitality sector, tourism in Banff. We have a study of tourism in Banff. Most of those are service workers, and most of them are international and Canadian migrant workers.
And increasingly, it's the service sector that are the most precariously employed, and the service sector workers may be working in one job that they have to commute to, may be stacking another job or two on top of that, and may need to transit between different jobs and have no more control or autonomy over the location or place of work in those multiple jobs.
Oh, that's part of the problem of the bluntness of the census information that we have. That you commute to work as though you're only going to one job. But I mean, lots of young people in particular are working multiple jobs. So you may be working multiple jobs in the same day. And they're using different modes of transportation. And I think that's the other thing. And often they're using multiple modes of transportation. So, I mean, a long distance labor commuter from Newfoundland who's working in Alberta is often driving, sometimes overnight from a remote community into a community with an airport. They're flying from that airport to another airport where they then will get picked up and they might get bussed into a work site. So it's not just one mode of transportation, and you have to connect those modes of transportation. You have to make them work together. And if they lose their synchronicity because of weather or any other number of problems, then you can basically end up not getting home or losing much of a rotation in terms of time with your family.
Right. When Mother Nature does play a big role in this.
In Canada, no question.
You can have all the best laid plans, and then you hit snowstorm or increasingly lightning that closes down airports. Or mudslides that close down roads. So we're not only needing to think about this from a family and a labor force perspective, but also a little bit from climate change perspective.
Absolutely, there's no question at all. And again, you if you're commuting in Toronto, you may be able to manage your day so that you're not commuting in peak rush hour, but lots of people can't. Or you may be commuting at a time when there might not be much traffic, but there's not many options for transportation.
So public transit closes at some point. It doesn't run 24 hours in most cases. So some people, especially service sector workers, may need to, sort of come up with new and interesting ways to commute. So let's go to another poll question. For those of you who do commute to work, how do you get there? Do you use your own power? Do you walk? Do you bike? Do you use your kayak? Or do you use your own vehicle, your own car or truck, public transit? Or do you use a train, plane, boat, or ferry?
Or some combination.
Some combination or some other completely. If you wouldn't mind just giving us a quick test on that question. Okay.
25% walk, bike, 63% own vehicle, and then 13% use public transit.
So nobody's using trains, planes, boats, or ferries. Again, not necessarily representative of the Canadian labor force. So let's dig a little bit deeper. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the specific sectors that you've been studying, Barb?
In addition to the types of workers I've talked about, we also were quite interested in people who are engaged in work in mobile work platforms. So they may not be commuting to work. If you're a trucker, you might be able to park your truck in your yard and leave from your yard in the morning, but you're still away from home for very prolonged periods, and you're engaged in mobility, and it does have consequences for your life. So we looked at among mobile work in mobile work platforms. We looked at trucking. The airline sector is another important sector in Canada, and we had a study that looked at pilots. Seafaring is another, particularly where we come from, is an important sector where workers can be away for, in the case of international workers, for months at a time, and certainly Canadian workers for at least a month, 6 weeks, and perhaps longer. And fish harvesters are also mobile workers, and some of them are away for prolonged periods as well. And ferry workers would be a final example of a worker who's employed on a mobile work platform. And again, some of them are commuting as well.
So one of the conversations we had recently in another study was with some truckers, and one of the things that they described was this team trucking, where as a way of sticking together or being with a spouse, people who are sort of late career, children are grown, the spouses are becoming truck drivers, so they team truck drive together. Another way of looking at synchronizing life is bring your family to work on the way across the country and back again.
And we've met, we have a digital story on our website of a couple who went to Alberta together and worked in a work camp, but they were not necessarily able to synchronize their schedules in the work camp, right? Or you may not be able to get the same job. But truckers are lucky if both of them can get a job. But I think one of the things about many of the sectors we're looking at, construction, transportation, and so on, is one of the things you find in those sectors is that there are relatively few women. And so again, one of the issues here is the relationship between mobility and gender, and the way in which mobility in key sectors makes it very difficult for women particularly to stay in those sectors.
And in particular, home care workers, where their workplace changes several times in a day, but getting to and from, they're on their own. It's their own time, it's their own costs. And for some, it means long periods of time to sit in a coffee shop waiting for the next appointment to happen. So that too can have an impact on the way in which people interface with work and the clock.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, that is a female-dominated sector, but it's also a relatively low-paid sector. And the time, particularly for home care workers, often the time spent between 2 hours in one household, 2 hours in another household is not paid, and neither is the transportation between. It may be paid for a nurse, but not necessarily for a home care worker.
We had one nurse the other day tell us a story about the new GPS system that the home care agency was using. And the minute that you exit the dwelling where the care is being provided, the GPS sends a note and you're off the clock. So even if you sit in your car and do notes, you're off the clock because you've left the dwelling. And GPS technology now controls who counts and who doesn't, and what time is yours and what time is theirs. So can you tell us a little bit about how these intersecting mobile workers sort of come together?
Sure. So this is a kind of good example. Sarah DeRoe at the University of Alberta has been working in the Fort McMurray region for quite a long time. And one of the things that she's doing is looking at all of these differently mobile worker populations in the Fort McMurray area and how they get slotted into different kinds of jobs, whether who's paying for their mobility or not paying for their mobility, and how long they're away from families and so on. So this is just a graphic showing all of these differently mobile groups and the different ways they're mobile in the Fort McMurray region. And it's very important that you have to understand, if you're really going to understand labor markets, you really have to understand the dynamics between these different groups. So extended mobility can affect a lot of things. As I said, it can affect labor market dynamics. It can affect recruitment and retention into the sector. And I just made the point about how we think mobility is playing a key role in keeping women out of certain sectors of the economy. It affects work scheduling. If you're away from home, you want to work. And we can see with trucking where they try to control the number of hours people can work. But when you go into the camps and you're away from home, you want to work because you are away from your family. But work scheduling can also affect families, as we'll see. It can affect health and safety. It affects community and regional development, and it certainly does affect families. And we're going to shift over to that now.
Yep. So let's take a look at some of the findings related to families. Barb, do you want to just tell us a little bit about what you found in all of these various studies coming together?
Well, just again, this is the relationship between mobility, work, and family is really quite understudied. We have literature on mobility, we have literature on work, we have literature on families, but we don't have much that really brings it together. And even if you look at the work-life balance literature, where you would expect to find attention to this, for the most part, the focus is family or work, and mobility is not there. It's really, people haven't paid much attention to it. And one of the things that we know from the census data that we were looking at is that if you, in households where you have somebody who's engaged in what we call excess commuting, so they're traveling quite a long distance away from home, what you'll notice is that statistically the likelihood that the mobility of their spouse is constrained is pretty obvious. And what that says is that somebody has to, in some sense, accommodate for the absence of the other person in that household.
So just before we move into how, where, and when this has an impact, let's just get a sense from you, the webinar participants, how much control do you have over where you live relative to your work? Do you have no control, some control, or control over where you live? And the next question, the next poll question we have is, do you have control over where you work? Have no control, some control, or control over your workplace? So Barb, if this is so hard and this is so complicated, why do people do this?
Well, I mean, I think there are economic reasons that are quite important. You know, I mean, if you need a job, you need to find a place to live, and you may or may not be able to find those two places in the same place. Or you may not be able to find a good job in a place that is near where you live. You may not be able to afford a house near where you're going to work, or you may not know where you're going to work, in which case you might as well find a good place to live and then commute.
So you may be working in construction in downtown Toronto, but you can't afford to live any closer than a 2-hour commute.
Exactly, and of course lots of people are doing that.
So tell us a little bit about how real this becomes in Atlantic Canada.
Yeah, so we have a high rate, particularly from rural areas. We have a high rate of interprovincial mobility from Atlantic Canada over the last decade, but it's long-standing, and it's a region with lower wages and higher unemployment. And the mobility tends to be to regions like Alberta, for example, where you have higher wages and higher employment. And we know now, some of the statistics are showing us that just over $3 billion in earnings came back into Atlantic Canada from interprovincial employment during 2012. And that was somewhere between 6 and 9% of the total labor force earnings across those 4 provinces. So that was a big kind of financial boost for the region and for those families. And there was tangible evidence of mobility in the types of housing construction that we were seeing in the region over the last little while. And so there can be a mobility premium, but there are also potentially, or what we call a mobility dividend. And this is another example: offshore oil workers who said they basically could earn at least double what they could make onshore, so they're away from home, but being mobile allowed them to live in rural communities where they wanted to live because it gave them extra income. But there are costs to mobility. So if one person is away, as I suggested, the person who's left at home is often constrained in terms of their ability to be mobile for work and has extra responsibilities, and it can introduce strains in marital relationships. And there are transportation costs and hazards. So again, lots of people are injured or run into problems on the road, commuting long distances. There are other hazards and costs. And often workers are paying those costs. They have to pay for the vehicles, they have to pay for the gas, they have to pay for the insurance. And if they end up in an accident, the cost falls to them. And virtual parenting is another cost that comes. If you're trying to synchronize your schedule particularly if you're in another time zone, with the schedule of your family at home, it's tough enough to synchronize schedules these days. I think, for people who are working with their other members of their family. But it's particularly hard if you're far away.
Especially if you're now talking about multiple time zones to coordinate as well.
You know, as for example, somebody who lives in the Philippines, their family's in the Philippines, and you know, many thousands of Philippine workers who work in Canada, often for very prolonged periods, trying to maintain some kind of relationship with the children they're supporting with the wages they're earning in Canada. And then, you know, you've got there are pluses and minuses here, but you know, if you engage in mobility, then you might be able to live close to one of your, you know, some members of your family, so you don't all have to move far away, and that can be great for grandparents, but it also can change their lives. And there certainly are situations in Atlantic Canada where the grandparents, both parents may be working away, and the grandparents essentially have become full-time caregivers, sometimes for fairly young children, and that can be a fairly prolonged and challenging obligation.
Can be exhausting.
Oh.
Okay, so thank you, Barb, for sort of putting all of the project and the issues of mobility and scheduling and families into context. And what I'd like to do now is to shift the conversation specifically connected to these fragile synchronicities. So I'm going to bring Elise back in on the conversation, and we're going to begin with one more poll question, and we're going to ask you if right now you have any children under the age of 15 or any other kind of dependent at home to whom you provide care. So can we have that poll question up, Yusra? Thank you. So quick poll test. The presence of children and dependents add a layer of complexity to mobile work, whether you're married or divorced, or whether you're looking after a sibling with a disability or a parent who's in need of care. That adds to the layer of complexity. Yusra, do we have some results from the...
Yeah, and I can share them. So I'm closing the poll right now.
Great. So 64% yes and 36% no. So of those of you who have dependents under the age of 15 or other family dependents, we have one more poll question for you, and that's: what kind of care do you depend on? Care in your community, care in your home, or care in a caregiver's home? That could be a grandparent, that could be a paid caregiver, that could be a service provider. Where do you find that kind of care that you depend on? And we'll just take a quick poll glance at the kind of care that those of you, almost 2/3 of you, have at least one dependent in your life. And Yusra, results?
Yeah, I am able to share them with you.
Okay, so 67 in the community, some in your home, and none in caregivers' homes. So that's fairly consistent with certainly a lot of the childcare that's being provided across the country. But it also means now if you're using care in the community, you have to coordinate your time with when the daycare center closes or the service is available. So Elise, can you, we have one more poll question here that we're going to ask you about your work schedule and whether or not you have control over that work schedule. So Yusra, one last poll question. How much control do you have over your work schedule? If your boss says you got to work late, but your daycare center closes at 6 p.m. and they charge you $25 a minute for every minute that you're late, do you have control over that? Or do you not? Quick poll answer. Yusra?
Yeah, and I'll just close the poll right now. Okay.
And so most of you have some control over your schedule. Very different from a lot of the people that were participating in some of these studies. So Elise, can you tell us a little bit about your study, about what you found, or sort of what questions you were trying to ask and have answered in the work that you were doing?
Yeah, for sure. So I started this project being interested, well, the thing that kind of got me interested in the first place was learning about these 24-hour daycares that were starting to emerge in the US, but also moving into Canada. And some of the stuff that I started reading was showing that the reason why people were seeking out 24-hour daycares were because of complex commutes and complex scheduling for their work. And they were mostly low-waged workers working in service sector, retail, and healthcare. And so I started by trying to understand how, if we were looking in Canada, how commutes were impacting family lives, and how then one's commute and one's work scheduling were kind of impacting family lives, how scheduling was impacting work commutes, how commutes were impacting scheduling, how all of these things were working together. And what were some of the issues that workers were facing regarding commuting and scheduling and family? And we decided to start with unionized workers first because it was a little easier to get access to that information and that data. And also, I think we think unionized workers are, I mean, in many ways, they are more of an elite group of workers. They have a union that helps represent them, but that doesn't mean many times that they're any less precarious than other precarious workers. So a lot of the workers that I talked to, or the unions that I talked to, were representing workers that were, while unionized, also very precarious, working on shorter term contracts, or often without any control over their schedules.
Great. So can you share with us a story about one of your research participants?
Yeah, so I wrote up this little vignette that would kind of give you a sense of the stakes of the research in a way that's a little bit more fulsome than just writing out the research. So to start with, I wanted to talk a little bit about Irina, who is a cleaner at a large metropolitan airport, earning minimum wage, so about $14 an hour, with a really unstable work schedule. Her shift schedule isn't regular every day. It's set by this complex algorithm that adjusts worker shifts based on things like when planes are coming in, when there's high passenger loads, so that you can maximize profit and find the exact right balance between profit and wage outputs. So that means she's often scheduled for evening shifts or overnight shifts or weekend shifts, and the fluctuating schedule that she's on impacts her ability to get benefits at her workplace and can sometimes be pretty detrimental to her finances. Some weeks she might have a lot of work, some weeks less. So in order to make ends meet, she often takes additional shifts that are offered, even though they will interfere with her family life, for things like daycare drop-off and pickup schedules or quality time spent with family. And because of the impact on her finances of an unstable work schedule, she's considered following in the path of many of her coworkers and taking on a second job. But with that, she worries about how she would find time to have to be with her family at all, and also with the instability of her schedule, how you sort of negotiate the rhythms between two jobs becomes even more difficult. And some days Irina doesn't get to see her kids at all because she will leave before they wake up, and she'll get home before they sleep. She travels on public transit, and her commute is really complicated and complex because when she's especially when she's traveling at night, because of buses and connections. So sometimes she'll show up for work and have to wait for an hour before her shift starts, or she will have to wait for an hour or two before the bus starts running again for her to leave. And a lot of this work and the scheduling and the long commutes have had a pretty significant impact on her health and mental health. So she doesn't have a lot of time to make it to regular checkups with a family doctor, to engage in like primary or secondary prevention activities, and she finds herself really stressed out and worrying a lot. So it's had impacts on her mental health, on her physical health, and on her ability to be the kind of participant in her family life that she wants to be. So that is just kind of like a little picture of one person and one person's life that kind of tells you a little bit about the workers that I interviewed and the people who represent them.
Well, it certainly makes it very real for us to be able to imagine how complicated that is. Can you tell us a little bit about work scheduling, mobility, and scheduling, and the struggle to synchronize?
Yeah, I mean, I think in almost every workplace, scheduling is very complicated, especially in the workplaces that I was looking at, which involved people working at airports, people working in home care, and people working in universities. So three really different sectors, but all sharing, a having similar complexities around scheduling and commuting and precarity. And so work scheduling is so complicated and complex that it often has there are entire departments that deal with it. And in some workplaces, it was the source of the vast majority of grievances and the reason why some workplaces had unionized.
So
there's also the issue of that, like, flexibility and inflexibility. I just wanted to touch on a little bit. In the home healthcare sector in particular, a lot of women have chosen to go into work in the home healthcare sector because of the idea of flexibility, that your work isn't a 9 to 5 set schedule Monday to Friday. And so initially that was what drew a lot of people into that sector. But the idea of flexibility and the definition of flexibility has changed a lot in recent years, and now it's less about workers having the flexibility to work around their life. It's become something more about a flexible employment relationship where people work when they're needed and not when they might need to or when it's most convenient for them. So flexible work actually becomes much more inflexible and more rigid for workers.
it's really interesting. So the work scheduling affects housing, transportation, care costs. Can you tell us about what some of the challenges are, the struggle to synchronize, and how families are managing that?
Certainly. Well, one of the major things is access to childcare and the capacity to get a standardized form of childcare. So in our poll, a lot of people said that they use childcare in the community, like at a daycare center or something. But for many workers with unpredictable schedules, whose schedules may be changing a lot, or who may be working outside of the standard hours, working on non-standard schedules, the ability to access childcare is really limited in a community setting. And so that means making use of more informal networks, which can often create a form of trickle-down precarity, where you're a precarious worker who only needs childcare certain days for certain hours, and then that gets passed down to your childcare provider, where you may need to pull your kids out or put your kids into that childcare on a very short notice, and it might be changing on a daily basis. So in that way, we see the precarity of one worker then contributes to the precarity of another worker. Also, a lot of people that I talked to relied heavily on family and kinship networks to cover the gaps in their childcare. This was especially true amongst some of the airport workers, but this was less true amongst the lower paid home care workers, many of whom were women who immigrated to this country and who didn't have large family networks to help support them. And so that was one really big problem for them, is what they were going to do when they didn't have someone to pick up the gap. And the other thing I found was that sometimes this struggle to synchronize and this reliance on family and kinship networks would sometimes create tensions within those networks and erode those networks of support, because you would be relying so much on a sister or a cousin or an aunt or a mother to help you pick up the slack when you couldn't be there to pick up your kids or when you needed an emergency childcare. But because your schedule was so unstable and your income was so low, you weren't necessarily able to provide that same support for them. So there was an inability to reciprocate, which kind of ended up eroding sometimes those networks and supports.
Resentment and animosity builds. So how else can fragile synchronicities impact life at home and life in the community?
Yeah, so a lot of the people that I talked to felt like they were dealing with a lot of mental health struggles, and yet were unable to access supports for those struggles because they simply didn't have time in their life. Many people said they didn't even have time to engage in the most basic of self-care activities like scheduling a haircut, let alone scheduling regular appointments with a therapist or
or even going to see a family doctor about, you know, even just getting things like an Ativan prescription or something to deal with feelings of stress and anxiety. And one of the people I talked to said a lot of her stress came from her unstable schedule and her commute by subway. And when she was underground on the subway, she felt this constant anxiety that the subway would break down or that it would stop, as it does often in Toronto. And she would be trapped underground, unable to call the daycare and let them know she would be late. And so a lot of her commuting and her mobility was marked by extreme stress and anxiety. And those feelings of stress and anxiety she saw passed down to her children. And she said she felt like her kids had this sense that parenting was not something that was joyful, but that was something that was stressful and anxiety creating. And she really didn't like that her kids were having that relationship to her. I talked to many people who talked about the feelings of stress and anxiety and how that they felt like was being passed on to their children and even being reflected in their children. So yeah, so all of those, the trying to make things work and that fragile synchronicity of pairing family life and complex commutes with unstable and very precarious work lives definitely had impacts on mental health and even physical health for a lot of people.
Well, certainly having been in the Toronto subway at rush hour, when it stops, you can feel the anxiety building as parents are frantically attempting to reach their childcare provider and let them know they're en route. So can you just sort of sum up what some of these results might be in the workplace?
Yeah, well, one of the things that was really concerning for a lot of people was especially this kind of idea of the punitive measures, especially around childcare. So arriving late to pick up your kids from daycare has a financial cost to it. You know, in some places it was $1 a minute, in some places it was $20 if you were 10 minutes late. You know, there was one daycare in Etobicoke, Ontario, that in 2016 instituted fines as high as $300 an hour if you were late. And if you were unreachable on the phone, so if you were trapped in the subway underground, for example, the fines could be $300 an hour, as well as a possible call to the Children's Aid Society if you couldn't be reached. So that leads to this sort of punishment for, you know, your inability to be somewhere on time and on schedule, and also really contributes to like extreme emotional distress and fear. But also, you know, not just that fear of being punished, like actually being punished by calls to Children's Aid or a financial punishment, but several workers noted that there was a lot of shame around being the last person to arrive at the daycare to pick up their kid. You know, this feeling like you were a bad parent, or that your being late was a reflection on your quality as a parent. So the punitive measures mixed with the shame and the feelings of bad parenting, you know, becomes this real source of stress and anxiety and just a really negative impacts on mental health. Then, of course, you have the ways in which workers become limited to casual or part-time work because of these schedules and this inability to match family life to an unpredictable schedule or to long commutes. So workers that I talked to sometimes felt like they had to remain in part-time positions because there wasn't really a lot else they could do to improve their situation. There was one worker in particular who had her job changed. The hours of her job had changed, the scheduling had changed, and it wasn't going to work for her in terms of a drop-off and pickup. It would end up costing her more money in childcare than she would be earning working on this new schedule. And so she had to go down to part-time hours in order to sort of not lose out more than she would. So, you know, a loss of hours and a loss of wages was a big thing for many of these precarious workers.
So we're going to open up the lines for questions in just a few minutes. And while you're composing your questions, Elise, can you just tell us briefly about what public policy is doing to encourage employers to be a little bit more supportive or understanding of fragile synchronicities. Can you just very quickly cover some of the human rights issues, and then we're going to open up lines for questions?
Yeah, so one avenue to support those people who are kind of balancing work and family responsibilities has been the Human Rights Code. And in the Canadian Human Rights Code and in all the provincial acts, except for New Brunswick, where these reviews are being added, family status has been added, which is considered a prohibited grounds for discrimination. So it means that employers have a duty to accommodate, meaning you have this obligation to adjust rules, policies, or practices that enable people to participate fully. And family status means, you know, anyone who has a familial relationship. You can't be discriminated against because of your familial relationship. And that has been used in some cases to argue for changes to scheduling. So you could be you could make a claim, a human rights claim, that you need a different schedule because of your family status, your family care responsibilities. But one issue that has emerged is that accommodation requests can be rejected due to undue hardship. And most of the union representatives and workers that I spoke to, first of all, many didn't even know that the duty to accommodate around family status existed. And those that did and who had brought claims against their employer around this duty to accommodate and family status had found that it was not particularly successful. So amongst those who'd attempted to use family status accommodations, the legislation wasn't successful, mostly because there are certain biases within the human rights documents themselves around what people's relationships to work are. So the human rights legislation operates on older ideas of what work was like. So, for example, one union representative was telling me about a member of hers who had been bumped out of her position due to layoffs in her organization, and the new position that she was bumped into required hours and commuting times that wouldn't allow her to be home for her child either before or after school. So she was a single parent who had newly immigrated to the country, so she didn't have extended family here, and so she had no one to share caregiving responsibilities with. So her union actually did make an accommodation request based on the Human Rights Code on her behalf, but the employer made an undue hardship claim and said that we can't change everything for you, so they offered her a different position with significantly reduced hours. And as I was just talking about earlier, she weighed her hourly wage against the cost of childcare before and after school and realized that the job with full-time hours wasn't going to be financially worth it for her. So in the end, she simply didn't have a choice and she had to take the reduced hours. So it's unclear. I think in some cases, the Human Rights Code and the duty to accommodate relies on an understanding of employment relationships that is kind of outdated right now. And we haven't actually seen any way in which mobility and commuting concerns specifically converges with the Human Rights Code recommendations. So can a home care worker or any other worker request a schedule that takes commute time and work time in relation to family status into account? Or can a worker cite rush hour traffic or winter travel or transit delays and overcrowding as part of the duty to accommodate application? That's really not clear as of yet. So that's something that is serious concerns for workers today that hasn't really been addressed.
So I'm going to ask both of you now if we could just answer all of the questions that are coming in from the panelists. Barb, Elise, strategies are available to workers and their families to help them balance between work mobility and work scheduling. Anything that you discovered that you think is leading or emerging or shows possibility potential to alleviate the stresses and strains on families?
So the point I wanted to make was that there is a lot of work being done to make this work. the point is that most of that work is being done by the workers and their families. There was actually an online survey that was done of employers. Kara Arnold did that work, and what became very clear in that was that for the most part, employers were not taking responsibility for the issues that were raised around mobility and the challenges of meshing these things. I mean, big employers might have employee assistance programs and so on that workers could use when they ran into trouble. But the point is that there really was not much happening on the employer side in terms of preventing some of the challenges that families were engaged with. And Lise has just spoken to, I think, the limitations on the policy side in terms of what the options are that are available. But Lise, you also looked at unions and some of the things that unions could do.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that many union representatives and unionized workers talked about first and foremost was that for their workers, wages was going to be a key way that people would be able to have a bit more control over their lives. And that's the main thing that unions, as they are currently constructed, can organize around, is wages. And so all of them said wages were really important, but they also asked what gets left out when you focus exclusively on wages. And so I talked to a couple people who are involved in, for example, the Toronto Airport Workers Council, and they operate a kind of community unionism, which is a union. They operate not as a union, but they incorporate unionized workers, non-unionized workers, community members, to sort of try to build, I guess, though, that sort of synchronicity into the lives of not just unionized workers, but non-unionized workers that work at the airport. And so a couple of their victories include they got the UP Express ticket price brought down for workers at the airport. They partnered in the Fight for 15 and got employers to help them supporting the $15 minimum wage. And they've been arguing for a transit hub and working with the airport authority on the transit hub initiative at the Toronto airport. And one of the things they're trying to do is incorporate a childcare center in the immediate vicinity of that transit hub so that workers who are coming from quite a far distance to get to their work at the airport would have a place near enough to the airport and near enough to transit to bring their children to. So those things were pointed out as really an important way in which to move forward and to try to build this in. And then also the idea of inclusive design was discussed by some people, where workplaces were designed more around workers and their needs, and kind of thinking about how you prioritize family-friendly workplaces.
So in the last minute that we have together, Barb, can you just wrap this up and sort of summarize the conclusions? And it sounds to me like we're all in this together. The level of understanding is increasing through all this extraordinary work that you and your partnership has been doing. Can you just sum up for us what you think about fragile synchronicities?
Well, again, I think that the part of the point here is that there's a lot of invisible work that goes into managing life in a way that allows you to accommodate family needs, the challenges around mobility, and uncertainties and challenges around work scheduling. And work is critical to the economic lives of families. It's a source of meaning for most of us. It's not as though you don't want to or don't need to work. So that work has to happen, and often if there are sacrifices that have to be made, those sacrifices are made by the worker. The family members, including the spouse and the children. And I think with the spread of precarious employment, the increase in commute length, its increasing complexity and tighter work scheduling, all of those things are exacerbating the challenges that families are dealing with. Employers are not doing a lot to address this. It's not a key focus in collective bargaining, and the existing public policies really haven't done a great deal. I mean, it's not really obvious or evident that this is a focus of attention at the policy level. And I think one of the reasons for that is that in Canada, travel time is not work time. It is not the responsibility of the employer to figure that out. So making, we have literature on work-life balance, but we're not really paying enough attention to this intermediate category of activity that really can affect work-life balance.
So it sounds like there's a lot of work to do. It also sounds like there's a lot of people who are interested in this topic, both as an employee, as an HR professional or practitioner, maybe an occupational health and safety representative, maybe a union representative, and people are looking for more information, and hopefully this bank of research will allow us to increase our knowledge and understanding so that we can start doing some of that co-design work. There is some additional resources available on the website, www.onthemovepartnership.ca, where there are additional resources and databases. I would love to close by thanking Dr. Thorburn and Dr. Neese and sharing the top line results from the On the Move Partnership and specifically related to fragile synchronicities. And would like to just thank the people that made it all possible for this project to have occurred. And special thank you to the folks who sponsored this particular webinar. Thank you so very much, Yusra, for all the work that you did in preparing this and co-hosting with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nora, for moderating the webinar and for your valuable contribution in making the presentation very interactive and lively. Excellent webinar. Thank you. Thank you, Barb and Elise. We greatly appreciate the time you took to share your knowledge about issues that workers and their families deal with, trying to synchronize family, mobility, and work scheduling rhythms. We also thank our audience for your interest and participation.